Hey Vision Chase, this is Dr. Bird here with another social studies lesson for you today. Today we're going to go back to the Old West as we talk about the actual construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and some of the effects that it had on the United States. Now I want you to imagine you are a teenager living in 1860 and your family decides that we want to go to the West and go to live on the prairie because there's so many opportunities. The government is giving away free land out there. And so I want you to imagine riding in a wagon that looks like this. And I want you to imagine that you are readying yourself for a 6-month journey out west. And last but not least, I want you to imagine that you have to go through this 6-month ordeal without your cell phone. Yes, it is true. It is true. A lot of people your age had to actually go through this 6-month journey out west without a cell phone. I know you're thinking, oh my gosh, how did they do it? But they actually did it. So the Transcontinental Railroad would create a flood of people coming into the West, and the West would be changed forever. So let's talk about the actual construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. So let's set a foundation for what we're going to talk about here. So when we say Transcontinental Railroad, let's look at that word, transcontinental. So trans is actually a prefix, T-R-A-N-S. So that simply means across. And then the second part of that word, continental, continent, so across the continent. So this railroad is going to stretch across the North American continent, from east all the way to the west coast. The Transcontinental Railroad was an important goal of Abraham Lincoln, and he authorized the building of the railroad even as he was trying to keep the Union together with the Civil War. In 1862 and 63, Lincoln would sign the Pacific Railroad Acts, authorizing the construction of the railroad. It was to be paid for by issuing land grants and loans to the builders of the railroad. Now, the builders will receive so much money per mile of track they completed. Now, this would be a huge incentive to get the builders moving as quickly as possible. Now, the building of the railroad was to begin in 1863 in Omaha, Nebraska. And Lincoln himself was invited to write a letter to be read at this groundbreaking ceremony. Interesting side note, only 1 month earlier on the battlefield in Gettysburg, Lincoln gave a famous speech known as the Gettysburg Address. Now, on the train ride from the battlefield, it was reported that the president became sick and weak. A rash also appeared on his body, and he was diagnosed with a form of smallpox. Now, it's important to mention that there are two competing companies that are in charge of building the railroad. The Central Pacific began in Sacramento, California, and worked eastward. The Union Pacific began in Omaha, Nebraska, and worked westward. Now, the Union Pacific had an easy time finding workers. Workers for the UP mainly consisted of soldiers from the Civil War. Now, the Union Pacific laid track at a faster rate because the land on the plains was flat. The challenges of the Union Pacific consisted of disease and violent encounters with Native Americans. Now, the Native Americans realized that as this railroad was being built, it would change their lives forever. Now, the Central Pacific had a difficult time finding workers, and they had a more diverse workforce as a result. There were freedmen and Mexicans who worked for the Central Pacific. Eventually, the Central Pacific decided to employ Chinese immigrants. The decision would prove to make the difference. Chinese workers would complete the toughest and most dangerous jobs on the railroad. The Central Pacific moved slower than the Union Pacific as a result of the mountainous terrain that they had to overcome. Now, again, these Chinese workers, they stepped up and they risked their lives working with dynamite to blast through the mountains. On many occasions, Chinese workers were lowered down mountainsides in baskets, and what they would do is they would drill holes for dynamite. And so they would light the fuse and they would be pulled up as quickly as possible so they wouldn't be hurt by the blast of the dynamite. The Chinese workers were also treated poorly. They were forced to sleep in tunnels they created, and they did all of these things while enduring the racism and prejudice of their co-workers. Additionally, they were also paid less for their work, even though they did most of the difficult tasks. Now, there was a party when the two sides met in 1869, and on May 10th, the last spike was driven into the railroad track, completing the Transcontinental Railroad. Now that the railroad was completed, a journey that took 6 months took 6 days by train. The West would be transformed forever as more states entered the Union as a result of more people moving westward. And unfortunately for the Native Americans, their land and their culture would be diminished as a result. The West would be more diverse, and the United States of America would transform and evolve, all because of this Transcontinental Railroad. Well, that's our social studies lesson for the day. Please be sure to check the website for more tips and tools to help you as you chase your vision of success. Also, feel free to download the worksheet that goes along with this video to further your understanding of the Transcontinental Railroad. Well, I'm Dr. Bird. Until we meet again, please keep chasing the vision. Thanks for watching. Bye. Today we're going to So let's set a bit of